Welcome to a clash of titans, Garry Kasparov versus Anatoly Karpov, a rivalry that defined an era of chess. Let's dive into another chapter of this legendary battle. Kasparov opens with pawn to e4, and Karpov meets him symmetrically. We see the Ruy Lopez on the board, with both players navigating the well-trodden paths of this classic opening. White castles and brings the rook to the e-file to support the center, while black develops and kicks white's bishop away with the b-pawn. And here, Kasparov plays the incredibly precise bishop to b3. This is the only move that keeps an advantage, preparing to support the center and setting the stage for his future plans. Both players continue to build. Karpov solidifies his pawn structure, and Kasparov pushes in the center with d4, completing development and setting up a complex middle game. The pieces begin to dance. Kasparov reroutes his knight and probes on the queen side with a4, while Karpov tucks his bishop away, preparing for the coming storm. The center opens with a pawn exchange. Black challenges with c5, white pushes forward, and then comes a signature Kasparov move. The rook lifts to a3, ready to swing into the attack. But Karpov isn't waiting around. He lashes out with f5, creating counterplay. Kasparov repositions his pieces to meet the threat, and queenside pawns are traded as the tension builds. A final pawn is exchanged in the center, and Kasparov's knight lands on the active e4 square. The stage is set for fireworks. Karpov captures on d5 with the knight, but this is an inaccuracy. The better move was taking with the bishop, which would have led to a sequence winning a pawn. This gives Kasparov his chance, and Kasparov pounces. The rook swings over to g3, immediately eyeing the black kingside. But Karpov plays pawn to c4, another slip that allows a powerful attack. The much-needed defensive move was rook to e6. Now the floodgates are open for white. Kasparov has a golden opportunity to launch a decisive attack, but amazingly, he misses it. The winning idea was a sacrifice. Bishop takes the pawn on h6, knight to d3, bishop takes the pawn on g7 with check. Black's bishop recaptures on g7, and queen to h5 with check, a crushing attack. But in the game, Kasparov instead plays the quiet bishop to b2, and the huge advantage evaporates. A massive let-off for Karpov, and Karpov seizes the moment, finding the solid defensive move rook to e6 that he should have played earlier. Kasparov plays knight to g4, but this is another imprecision. The computer preferred knight to g5, and now the position is nearly equal, but Karpov errs again with queen to e8. He misses the chance to force simplifying trades with knight to d3, and just like that, the initiative swings back to Kasparov. And Kasparov doesn't need a second invitation. He smashes through with knight takes pawn on h6, a powerful sacrifice tearing open the king's defenses. Karpov is under immense pressure. He responds by pushing the pawn to c3, but this is not the best defense. The rook should have recaptured the knight on h6. Then knight takes the pawn on d6, queen to h5, the queens come off the board, and the rook recaptures. Instead, in the game, Karpov plays pawn to c3, allowing Kasparov to build an unstoppable attack. And now, a thunderbolt, knight to f5, a brilliant move. Kasparov sacrifices his bishop on b1 to bring another attacker into the fray, and the threats against the black king are overwhelming. Karpov has no choice but to accept the sacrifice, and the pawn takes the bishop on b2. Kasparov brings his queen to g4, piling on the pressure. It's still a winning position, but this is a slight inaccuracy that gives black a glimmer of hope. But Karpov fails to find the only defensive path. He plays bishop to c8, which is the final decisive mistake. The only try was knight to c2. After bishop takes the knight, rook to c8, knight takes the pawn on g7, and queen to g6, creating just enough counter threats to stay in the game. But after the move played, bishop to c8, it's all over. Kasparov has a clear path to victory. Kasparov wastes no time, delivering a check with his queen to h4. Karpov blocks with his rook to h6, but this is an inaccuracy that only simplifies white's task. Kasparov's knight simply snaps off the rook on h6. The recapture with the pawn on h6 further shatters black's king safety, and Kasparov's advantage continues to grow. Before delivering the final blows, Kasparov calmly tucks his own king away to h2. And that's a fatal mistake. Queen to e5 looks active, but it walks straight into a devastating tactic that wins the queen, and Kasparov sees it instantly. Knight to g5, a fantastic shot. Here's the point. If bishop to f5, knight to ef7 is check, the king moves to h7, and the knight takes the queen on e5, winning the queen. Karpov tries queen to f6, but in a completely lost position, this just allows an even quicker finish. Another monster move from Kasparov, rook to e8, is simply crushing, threatening to win more material and forcing a swift end to the game. Karpov, with no good moves left, plays bishop to f5. This is a blunder that allows a forced checkmate. The best try was bishop to e6. Then rook takes bishop on e6, rook to a7, rook takes the queen on f6, and knight recaptures, though the position was hopeless anyway. But after the move in the game, bishop to f5, Kasparov has a mate in 6 on the board. Unbelievable. With a forced mate on the board, Kasparov blunders. He misses the crushing blow. The win was knight to f7, check. After queen takes the knight, queen takes the pawn on h6 is check. Bishop blocks on h7, and rook takes rook on a8 is mate. But back in the real game, Kasparov instead plays queen takes pawn on h6 with check, throwing away the forced win. Karpov recaptures with his queen on h6, but this is also an inaccuracy, failing to make the most of Kasparov's mistake. Kasparov doesn't miss twice. He finds the brilliant knight to f7 check, the only move that keeps the win, and gets the attack right back on track. The king steps to h7, but under this relentless pressure, the position is simply collapsing for black. Another fantastic shot. Bishop takes bishop on f5 with check. This continues the forcing line that will win black's queen. Karpov is forced to block with his queen on g6. And what is happening? Kasparov blunders again. In an unbelievable turn, he chooses the wrong recapture. The simple win was rook takes queen on g6. Black promotes the pawn to a queen, knight to g5 is check, the king moves to h8, and the bishop takes the new queen on b1, winning cleanly. But instead, he captures with bishop takes queen on g6 with check, allowing Karpov a chance to fight on. And Karpov finds it. The brilliant king to g7 is the only move to keep the fight alive, a truly great find in a desperate position. Kasparov trades rooks on a8, and Karpov sets up a defensive blockade with his bishop on e7. The rook swings to b8, but this is another small inaccuracy from Kasparov, who misses a more clinical path to victory. Karpov pushes his pawn to a5, but activating his king was the more stubborn defense. The win is getting closer for white. Kasparov gives a check with his bishop to e4. It's still completely winning, but it's not the most precise way to convert. The cleaner finish was knight to h8. After king to f6, rook to f3 is check, king to e6, and bishop to f5 is check, a more straightforward win. Back in the game, the check comes on e4, leading to the final sequence. The pieces now come off the board in a flurry of exchanges, and when the dust settles, Kasparov's rook snaps up the b2 pawn, leaving him with a decisive material advantage. And at this point, Anatoly Karpov resigns. A chaotic masterpiece full of twists and turns, but in the end, Kasparov secures the victory. Black is down a full rook with no hope of counterplay. Knight to f6, rook to f3, pawn to d5, pawn to g3, pawn to d4.